professor in philosophy in the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion, and responsible for the decor. Yay! So, and is head of the Phronesis Lab, and I think she's going to be talking about some of that stuff today. And so she will be talking about her new book project.
Yeah.
Politically Engaged and Objective. And we'll see how this is not an oxymoron.
That's right.
So, okay.
Thanks, Anita. Thanks for the
Yay.
So often when we have intimate groups like this, we have like name, we go around and introduce each other, but we're being YouTubed. Hey, Stuart Sarbacher, yay! And so, actually we might not be YouTubed, depending on the success of the, I should leave that open for later.
Yeah.
And we want to get through some material. This takes about 35 minutes, and I would love feedback because I have 4 chapters done. This is not the title of the book, mostly because the book has no title. And it's not aimed at any of you, actually. It's aimed at an intellectually curious public that might have had an undergraduate degree. And I also want folks who don't share my more liberal political outlook to be tempted to get to about page 35. I assume I'll lose them at some point, but I want you to stay with me as long as you can, as long as you can stand it, because this is important. All right. So, right, this iconography here of the Bride of Frankenstein. So we've got, she's literally being constructed. But we could talk more about technology and gender construction in a second. Okay. So the basic plot of the book. All right. Political values are not importantly different from descriptive claims in science. Some evaluative claims, like some descriptive claims, can be more or less well supported by the evidence of experience. And I should say a lot of work is being done by the phrase are not importantly different from the descriptive claims. This is an exercise in shifting the burden of proof onto those folks who think that for a book designed for an intellectually curious public, we need to get into meta-ethical concerns about objectivity of values that I don't want to address. But Alan Thompson isn't here, so... All right, so the claim is that even for evaluative claims, this support of the evidence of experience can be as objectively assessed in the case of values as in the case of facts. So the flip side is that science is value-laden. So I should say that people like Sam Harris, I think, have done a good job of talking about this element of things for the general public. I don't think this, the flip side of the case is made quite as well. So hopefully that will be a contribution. So political values are often implicit and assumed in scientific work. They operate as auxiliary or background hypotheses that are ubiquitous in even our best science. The main points that I'm going to play on here are objectivity, impartiality, contingency, and dogmatism. What do I mean here? Objective scientific research does not need to be value-free. It needs simply, to be well supported by an impartial assessment of relevant evidence claims, some of which we might sort as political. The main danger then to objectivity in science is not political content itself, but the implicit and dogmatic role that this or any other kind of content plays. So there's a variety of descriptive commitments you might have as you go into an experiment, for example, that leads you to expect certain outcomes, and we know all of the cognitive biases that will then affect how you look at the results of those sorts of experiments when they conflict with your expectations. Okay, some more plot here. Inductive risk becomes important here. Even when we are explicit and non-dogmatic about the evaluative and descriptive auxiliary hypotheses underlying our scientific research, we could still be mistaken. We are faced then with making decisions about what risks of error we are willing to accept and why. So what is the worst that could happen if we're wrong? And in the literature that I work in, this is called inductive risk. And our predictions about the future, always uncertain is future. We become more Yoda-like as we enter this part of the talk. And so not just with our evaluative claims, but even with our descriptive claims, there's levels of uncertainty built in. We then have to make decisions about what kinds of uncertainty we're willing to accept, what kinds of risks in being mistaken are we willing to accept. And this was a popular cartoon going around with respect to climate change. right? So here's all the things that would happen if we think that climate scientists are going in the right direction. What if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing, right? Let's say the climate models are wrong. I mean, modeling is tricky. We can't run direct experiments. The time scale is too huge. So we have to do a lot of modeling. There's a lot of statistical assumptions involved. We don't have as much data as we'd like going backward in the geological record. So there are some risks involved. In going forward, we might be wrong on some of the details with respect to climate modeling and the concerns about anthropogenic causes of climate change. What's wrong? What would happen if we went forward assuming that was right? And the concern is, well, you know what? The world would still be a better place. This needs to be argued, but I think the cartoon does a good job. Okay, so then the flip side, values are science-laden. So political values are not importantly different from descriptive claims in science. As I said, they operate as hypotheses. They can be objectively assessed. They can be right or wrong. So some definitions need to be worked out here at this point. What do I mean by objective assessment? And this actually ties in, where's Anita, with questions about what we do in Fernice's lab. So the impartial weighing of the relevant sets of evidence provided by our lived experience moving in and around our world in communication with others. That's what I mean by an objective assessment. And I think folks in the humanities do this just as much as folks in the social sciences and sciences. And at least part of what we're trying to do in Fernice's lab is be more explicit about that, the fact that that's what we're doing, that we have evidence for our claims, that we're prepared to reject our claims when the evidence isn't in their favor, such that when it turns out we're all supporting liberal political agendas, it's because we have really good evidence for having done so, for example. Yeah? So none of us can be neutral, but we can strive to be impartial. Let me talk about that distinction a little. So we are all going to have commitments that are in some sense prior to whatever project we bring to we're examining. So we're not going to be neutral, we're not going to be stripped of those sorts of commitments, but the best we can demand of ourselves is that we impartially weigh, and always be in the project of trying to impartially weigh whether those commitments are worth keeping. Okay, so engaging in this process is a skill that we can all get better at. It develops over time, and it takes practice. Elizabeth Anderson has this wonderful paper on the uses of value judgments in science, where she talks about the process of examining your evaluative commitments, your political claims, for example, and rejecting them or abandoning them as you learn new information that conflicts with them. She says, we do this all the time, it's called growing up. So, of course, it's not that straightforward, but okay. So political values then, what do I mean by political values? Just a moment here to define. This is a very boring and not particularly sophisticated definition, but I think it works for what I'm doing in the book. Political arrangements in any given society are those arrangements, informal and formal, that involve the distribution of power in terms of resources, namely who has it, who does not, and why. Political value claims concern evaluations of those political arrangements. And the informal ones are the ones I'm the most interested in. The formal ones we might think of in terms of, say, political parties and questions of the representation of citizens' interests in terms of voting in members that represent their interests in a formal political system. The informal arrangements with respect to who has power, say, in this room, are not so much related to Democratic and Republican commitments, but more about gender and age and seniority and union representation and who's getting the 3% raise and who isn't, right? Okay, so here's the standard view that on a good day, claims expressing descriptive facts can be objectively assessed. And I should say on a good day, because there are some folks who don't even think that we can objectively assess descriptive claims. I have nothing really to add to them today. They're wandering around in a matrix-like confusion that I'll deal with them another day. All right. So imagine that we can objectively assess in the way I described descriptive facts. The standard view then is that on no days can claims expressing political values be objectively assessed. Values are subjective through and through. Facts are not. So some standard ways of characterizing the differences between subjective values and objective facts And why these characterizations are misleading shall now follow. So here's one way. Subjective values versus objective facts. Subjective values are mere preferences, and objective facts are claims backed up by evidence. So one way of talking about this. So I think it's better to say subjective claims are those that are vague, they're difficult to test, and about which no one cares. Objective claims are more specific, about which we care, and for which evidence can be marshaled. And we can find evaluative and descriptive claims of either sort. So I don't think the subjective-objective divide here cuts the evaluative and descriptive in the way most folks think. Right, probably in the question period we can talk more about examples. Okay, here's another way of running at explaining why these seem to be different. Political values describe subjective inner states, whereas the claims of science describe objective outer states of the world. But wait, what about properties such as color and weight? And some of you have read some of my work on with Bill Ogis on race and value judgments. We've talked a lot about this. There's an objective fact of the matter about whether something weighs 5 kilograms rather than 10. Sorry, actually, I was in Canada last week, so 5 pounds rather than 10 kilograms. What is this? Or it's green rather than red. Luckily, the color chart is international. Even though we would not want to claim that colors or weights are outer states of the world. Right? So there are some properties that we have no trouble talking about as being some kind of combination of interior perceptual equipment and the outer world, and yet, despite the fact that there's an internal subjective sort of component to gauging color and weight, we have no trouble saying that there's facts in the matter about whether Stephanie is wearing a black shirt rather than a red one. Okay. So outer and inner aren't helpful sorting criteria with respect to which things are objective and thereby fall under the scope of science and which are not. Our judgments of properties such as color are similar to our judgments about properties that express values, for example, judging someone as lazy. Learning the correct application of the color predicate green or the value predicate lazy, so think about these as the color feature green or the value feature lazy, requires the same sort of empirical examination that's required when we identify something as being, say, a certain molecule or the member of a certain species. And I use those examples for a reason, mostly because there's huge disagreements about them. Come to this in a second. We can be right or wrong in our applications. Wishing will not make it that something that is green or lazy is instead red or industrious. There's an objective, though of course contingent, fact of the matter about whether something can be identified as green or as lazy. So the contingency here is crucial, and it's a contingency that needs to be recognized on both the fact and the value side of the equation. Could be wrong. New evidence could make us shift our assessment. Okay. Here's a final way that you often hear the difference between values and facts described. Value claims are subject to differences of opinion, while objective facts have a consensus of science. Wait a second. Let's look at some examples. I'll run through them, but this one actually brings us nicely to the climate modeling again. I should say I'm a little nervous when the rationale for supporting the current scientific consensus is that there is a scientific consensus. 99,000 scientists out of some large number agree, therefore we should all line up. I want to focus less on the consensus than the rationale underlying the consensus, which is that we have a lot of fucking evidence supporting the view, right? It could still be, but it's contingent evidence, and it could still turn out to be something that we want to re-examine. Lots of folks agreeing on something could still be wrong. So I don't want to focus as much on the consensus. And we know the historians of science in the room, all kinds of folks who were outliers in the historical record with respect to the kinds of scientific views they held on to turned out to be right. So I want to push away from the consensus. Let's look at some other examples. So grass is green, ethnic categories are irrelevant when judging laziness, individual organisms belong to the same species just in case they can interbreed, for water is the molecule H2O. So cases 3 and 4 might stand out as objectively true, descriptive claims of science. The historians in the room, the philosophers of biology are laughing at 3, no, 4 even. Hasek Chang has this beautiful new book, right? Oh, God, he's so good. John, we're colleagues at Stanford. His book also on temperature, the history of, oh, so good. All right, so There's probably more agreement about the application criteria and empirical evidence for claims about grass being green and ethnic categories being irrelevant to the judging of laziness than there is to claims about molecular properties and species. It turns out that pure samples of H2O are really not good to drink. They don't have the properties that we normally associate with water. So defining macro properties of the world in terms of their molecular properties turns out not to be as straightforward as we might think. Get 4 biologists in a room and ask them to define what counts as a species, and they'll be bloodletting. Okay. Okay. So again, even with the lack of consensus about application criteria, still there's little doubt that there's a contingent but decidable fact of the matter in each of the 4 cases. So just to review where we've been at. Political values are not importantly different from descriptive claims in science. They operate as hypotheses, as capable of being right or wrong as any other. Just as with descriptive claims in science, we can have evidence for or against political values. We can be as objective or subjective in evaluating political values as we are with descriptive claims in science. And there can be as little or as much consensus in defining political values as there is in defining descriptive claims in science. Okay, so the science is value-laden focus here now. Political values often operate as implicit hypotheses that are ubiquitous in our best science. So we've been talking about ways in which value claims are science-laden, let's say. We'll now talk about how science is value-laden, and as I hinted, this is the part where I think folks like Sam Harris don't pay as much attention to this side of it. So value-laden decisions affect sorting at many different levels. Some sorting is more or less explicit. So think about the decisions that go in, consciously or not, with respect to sorting the data available to conscious awareness. The data chosen for collection is evidence. The evidence found to be significant. The framing of evidence as support for the hypothesis. Decisions made about when to stop testing a hypothesis, right? There's, I'm always forgetting his name. When experiments end. Gallison?
Yes.
Yes, oh, yay. Great text, but it turns out how experiments end. Yeah. I mean, so we see the final product, the printed version of the paper, which is a nice rationalization of a much messier process, and in some sense it's kind of arbitrary when you decide that you've got the data collection that you needed to examine the hypothesis under test. So let's look at a feminist case study of the effects of sexist political values in microscopy. So I'm going to assume that almost all of you guys have run into this example before, but maybe not. No? Okay, cool. This is just fun. It's fun. Okay, hang on. Okay, so it turns out Emily Martin, I want to say anthropologist, and the Swarthmore Gender and Biology Study Group, right around the same time, we're starting to look at ways in which a variety of claims about, well, in the case of Emily Martin, conception, were gendered through and through in particularly odd ways, and that different sorts of political values seem to underlie a lot of the claims that were being made about the relationship between the sperm and the egg, in ways that now seem quaint in 2014. But for those of us who are over 30 in the room, this was not that long ago that it shifted. So the idea is, in the literature on this, from university biology textbooks to some even technical work in biological journals, describing the sperm as, like an S on the chest, S not just for sperm, but some super sperm perhaps, and and active, and they have to swim so hard, and they penetrate the egg, and there's this contest, and the swimming, my God, the swimming, and the egg is this passive, slumbering. She, first of all, always she's usually slumbering. She's slothful. She's passive. She's waiting for her man. She's actually looking a little too come hither in this cartoon, but anyway. And so when I talk about this in class with students, often they're like, well, but isn't that the truth? I mean, the sperm have to swim so far, and then you basically have to remind them about the length of vaginas, which are not that. Let cervix get this on YouTube, right? So like cervix, right? I mean, finger's length. I mean, extend extends during penis vagina sex, but it still, the penis that hits the cervix, all the sperm then has to do is go through the cervix, and then it turns out, research recently, the tails that you think, oh, driving them forward, it turns out most of the energy of the tails just goes side to side. And there's actually kind of a lunar tidal thing going on that just sort of, plus the explosive force of the release of the semen, thank goodness, really that's what's doing most of the work. And then of course the egg has to come from, See, I know, but why are we invested in this? I mean, so the women are like, we have to work too. No, it's eggs. So we seem to have an investment in our gametes in ways that we don't in, say, our elbows or our hearts or our livers. Like, so, when women are told that they can't produce enough eggs, it's a blow to their femininity, their sense of themselves as a woman. When men are told their sperm count is low, and then this is a Canadian thing I have to describe for you guys, but so in Canada, anywhere where hockey is played, see, I'm missing the best part. Okay, it's not because I'm talking about hockey. He told me ahead of time he had to leave. Okay, so guys, when they in heterosexual relationships and they're baby, yay baby, and here's the thing they do. They mime skating on one skate, and then this, and they're like, I got one past the goalie. Right? There's a sense of achievement because of the identification with their sperm in ways that you don't hear people talking about other body parts that way. So yeah, so the ovum clearly has to move from the ovaries to the fallopian tubes where conception takes place, and then she has to go all the way down to the uterine wall, hang on for dear life. Okay, so it's odd that this narrative has continued. It's starting to become a less of a go-to narrative. Students that I talk to now are less likely to have heard this narrative in their biology classes. Okay, so for the historians of science in the room, I'm just going to do some quick and dirty little time chart here. As early as 1795, you hear some of this language that the sperm awakened the slumbering egg. And there's lots of penetrative stuff too. I'm just shortening it. But as early as 1895, photographs. It turns out sea urchins, the gametes are large enough that even with rudimentary microscopy available at the time, you can see that the egg has the microvilli, at least in the sea urchin case, that as the sperm comes closer, envelop the sperm head and clasping the head of the sperm, trapping and guiding it in. So, a more active than is allowed for in the narrative. But in 1978, and again I'm just skipping here, these are biology textbooks available for university students, still describe conception as a penetrative process where large numbers of sperm reach the vicinity of the egg and attack the jelly-like protective substance that surrounds the egg. Okay, and then here is the more technical paper I foreshadowed. Weakness of sperm self-flagellum for forward or penetrative motion, that in fact most of the energy that is provided by the flagellum is side to side, which then leads us to all kinds of good jokes about men not wanting to ask for directions. It's all about the sperm. All right, in 1991, this is from Discover magazine, so it's not a technical science source, but and this is a woman reporter, science reporter, still summing up the view available at the time. She still describes sperm in masculine, even militaristic tones. Sperm are formidable, 24,000th inch weapons tipped with a chemical warhead, hardy foot soldiers, tactically smart.
And you said that's a woman author.
Yeah. Well, so this is the thing to remember, right? I mean, these are narratives available for everyone. And around 2005, so I actually went to the library and just pulled this university library just pulled every biology textbook that I could find through the ages. And it was about 2005 that I started to see difference in the way things were described. In sea urchins, egg cytoplasm bulges out at this point where the sperm meets, engulfing the head of the sperm, and permitting the sperm nucleus to enter the cytoplasm of the egg. Now, surely this is just going in the wrong direction. You know, she's like, you know, we filled out our consent form. But the engulfing, there's some active language here. Okay. So, resistance by some scientists and science journalists can be explained by appeal to the theory-ladenness of observation. So here's a long bit. What does that mean? Biologists working with sexist political values as background assumptions were unable to explain their observations of gametes, or perhaps even observe the gametes as gametes, without appealing to a web of interconnected background theories, including theories about optics, theories about sea urchins, views of conception as a microcosm of adult human courtship, and false views about the natural capacities of men and women regarding strength and passivity. All of this has got to have been at play, and ladening is the idea, this background set of theories ladening the stuff they were observing. Everyone had access, presumably, to the same observations. And then contemporary biologists have a different set of background theories that no longer include false generalizations about the natural capacities of men and women. So their hypotheses about the role of gametes in conception are more objective than earlier hypotheses in the way I've described objectivity. Another way you could describe the long hangover and the more recent switch is by explaining it by appeal to the underdetermination of theories by evidence. So when you have a number of competing hypotheses, let's say one hypothesis that eggs play a passive role, and the evidence for this concern observations of, say, the relative size and number of eggs versus spermatozoa. So this gets talked about a lot. Well, of course, there's tons of sperm, there's only one egg. That lends itself to, and also the egg is larger, and the sperm are smaller, therefore they're more easily, I don't know, well, I should try and make this more compelling. So there's more sperm, they're more mobile, right? The egg is bigger, and so that kind of evidence with respect to the amount and the size can be used to support the hypothesis that eggs play a passive role. That eggs play an active role can be the evidence for that is observing what the gametes do during conception. And so now you have this competition when choosing between hypotheses that are underdetermined by the available evidence, believed at the time to be directly relevant. We must marshal other kinds of often implicit evidence claims to make the choice. So it's the evidence believed to be relevant at the time doesn't determine one hypothesis or another, is the claim. These hypotheses are underdetermined by the available evidence. So if we have to choose one or the other, we have to bring in other stuff. And the other stuff then is going to be presumably political values. So some of the other kinds of evidence claims might be political values. Now, of course, in the case of both hypotheses, that eggs are passive and eggs are active, the view that conception is a microcosm of adult human courtship is false. So ultimately, both sexist and feminist political values are irrelevant, right? But not yet. And until then, feminist political values will increase the empirical adequacy of hypotheses informed by them when compared to hypotheses informed by sexist political values. So it would be nice one day that in the discussion of what happens at the moment of conception with respect to the gametes associated with males and females, that these extra sorts of evidence claims about the relationship between what goes on in conception and courtship rituals of adult humans is completely, that connection is completely strict. But it isn't yet. And so given the ways in which we are still invested in gametes, it is more objective to at least describe what the gametes are doing in ways that don't impose sexist views of the natural capacities of human females and males. All right. Another place where political values are often explicit concerns diagnostics and measurement more generally. So setting limits for boundaries of errors of type 1, they're called false positives in the literature, versus type 2, those are false negatives, often require appealing to hypotheses that have explicitly political content. So deciding which error is worse requires evaluating what has been called inductive risk, brought up earlier, an evaluation that often involves political hypotheses implicitly or explicitly. So, for example, Think about our students are bombarded with claims that everyone in the US should get tested for HIV, right? That's sort of the standard line right now. And what that means is you're going to get the current tests available. If large parts of the population get tested, you're going to get higher false positive rates, right? Presumably because we're going to presume that most folks don't have HIV. And so when we increase, and you guys can sort of remember how the statistical models go, if you increase the number of folks who are unlikely to have the thing that's being detected by the test, you're going to increase the number of false positives. The policymakers who decided this was okay, you can just think about the politics involved in this. The idea is that it's better for folks to think that they have HIV when they don't, than for them to think they don't have HIV when they do. So if you get tested and it looks like you've got HIV, then you go for a more expensive test that has a different set of detection levels set, and all kinds of huge policy debates about where to set those significance levels. And that's for maybe stuff about HIV automatically sounds politically charged, but testing the amount of dioxin in your water supply, Hasn't Changed book about deciding when water is boiling turns out to have been fraught, absolutely fraught. And if you try to boil water today, you will know there's differences where you put the thermometer with respect to where in the pot, what kind of pot, especially what temperature, what's this, not temperature, thank you, altitude and elevation, right? So when you set standards for boiling points, you have to run over a lot of these differences, and the decisions to do that require a lot of assumptions that aren't directly relevant to questions about boiling points. Okay. So just to review here, objective scientific research then does not need to be value-free, if I'm right. It needs instead to involve relevant sets of empirically robust hypotheses, some of which we might sort as political. Another important feature of objective scientific research is that ideally the hypotheses involved are recognized to be contingent. They may need to be reassessed as new information emerges. We all need to guard against dogmatic commitment to our hypotheses, political or otherwise. This is where I have conversations with my feminist colleagues all the time about, well, what elements of your feminist political values would you be willing to give up? Are you suggesting that it could turn out that, you know, I was just pointing at Sandy, we were just talking about this. Let's say it turns out that men aren't the intellectual equals of women. Then, you know, what if women are way smarter than men? Then this whole sort of equality thing you've got going, you might have to abandon. And it's true that commitments to equality with respect to the natural capacities of folks described as males or females, the data we have on this is that the male-female split makes no difference whatsoever into sorting intelligent from non-intelligent. But it could be that that changes, yeah. But then think of all the other things that would have to change, right? I mean, we have so much information supporting that, so much data supporting that. The ripple effects of the kinds of things that would have to change are really hard to get our hands on, and that's part of what makes it hard to imagine a time where that would be wrong. Not because, oh, I must hold on to my views no matter what they are, but I can't imagine a time where the views would be different. So the failure of imagination is what's going on here, and not the commitment to the view that, say, feminist political values must always be right. The reason feminist political values seem to be right at the moment is because they're really well connected to all the evidence we've gathered for the last 500 years, right? So it's a lot. Okay, but they could be wrong. I say 500 years, but it's longer. So the main danger to objectivity in science is not political content itself, but the implicit and dogmatic role that this or any other kind of content plays. So one of my favorite examples involving the violation of these edicts, where implicit political values play a dogmatic role in science, comes from comedian Jim Gaffigan, and this is just a little 20-second clip. So.
I was watching Animal Planet. Do you know that the male seahorse has the baby? And I was thinking, why don't they just call that the female seahorse? You know, it's just some stubborn scientist, you know? Yeah, that one there's male seahorse. No, that one's having a baby. Male has the baby. You're fired.
It's the "you're fired" line, really, that's sticking you. Screw you and the horse you rode in on. All right. Okay.
All right, moving forward then. Political values affect scientific research all the time, but not always for the worse, sometimes for the better. This is counterintuitive. I've shown, however, that we can make the distinction between political values that affect science for the better and those that affect it for the worse. Or at least I do that in my book. I tried to gesture how I'm doing it here. I admit that, as with everything, we might get the distinction wrong in particular cases, but I've argued there are ways to check, and we might get it right. And more than ever, it's important that we get it right. Yay!